a podcast to honor the gods.
This better come with a sacrifice.
Deus Ex Media.
Content and Capable recognises the Indigenous people on the land of which we record this podcast on, the Bowendig people. We offer a respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Sovereignty was never ceded. Welcome to Content and the Capable. Content and the Capable. Wow, that's a name for a podcast. The podcast that seems to be trying to do everything and nothing all at once. I'm Sam. That's just me, who I am normally, and I don't apologise for it, but also I apologise for it because everyone's right? Joining me today is Alycia from Civics Coffee. Hi, Alycia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, thank you for dealing with my rambles. For those who have not heard of Civics and Coffee before, did you want to give a quick little intro of what your podcast is all about?
Sure. Yeah. So Civics and Coffee is a weekly history podcast focused on U.S. history. And my elevator pitch for everybody is I cover the people, places, and things in United States history and the time it takes you to drink a cup of coffee. So my episodes are usually pretty brief, no more than 15, 20 minutes. I break that up a little bit with historian interviews and author interviews, which tend to be a little bit longer. But generally speaking, my weekly fare is short and sweet and to the point. Really just intended to pique people's interests, and I hope at the end of the episode that they want to dive more into any topic that I've covered and learn a little bit more about United States history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of, the history that you might not quite realise exists or may not be across. How did you get into doing that?
Yeah, so this was actually a COVID project.
As all good podcasts are.
Yeah, I was convinced that it was not going to last very long. So it's funny to look back 4 years in August to see that, it's still going. So 2020 was a very historic year for a number of reasons. Obviously, the world was shuttered due to a global health pandemic. And in the United States specifically, there was just a lot of historical happenings. We had lots of social justice initiatives, the murder of George Floyd. We had a historic presidential season with a pretty diverse range of candidates, despite who we ended up with in November. And so I was just finding myself talking with friends who had previously said that they weren't very big history nerds, weren't fans of history, but yet they liked talking about history, with me. And so I thought, well, there's a there, I think. And so just started to think about how can I contribute to the conversation. I knew that there was plenty of historical podcasts out there. It's pretty big genre if you look at any of your favorite podcasting apps. And one thing I did notice is that a lot of them were pretty long form, 2-3 hours to do those super deep dives. And I know adults, we're all busy and there's lots of demands on our time. And so I thought, well, how about I build a podcast covering things that people probably remember learning in high school, but maybe, don't remember. And also kind of those other stories that they might not be familiar with in short, succinct episodes so that people can, again, generate that interest in history and maybe discover that they like history more than they thought.
I love that. I love the and you're very right, that whole shift towards longer format, not even just here in podcast land, but in general, saw some of the reactions to being able to, upload hour-long TikToks, which just seems completely silly in the context of what we know as TikTok today.
Yes.
But it is a fascinating thing because we are busy people, And it's interesting the amount of like different roles podcasts can play. Podcasts like yours, you know, sure, as you said, in the time it takes to drink a coffee, you can, you know, pique an interest, learn something a little bit different, something new, and take that along with you. And there are other podcasts I listen to that I just like, it's there for the background noise more than anything, or it's there to make me feel like I'm a part of a conversation, you know, and it's so fascinating that each of these can fill different roles. You talked about, obviously, a lot of historical stuff happening in 2020. Do you think that people are becoming more interested in history as, you know, more quote-unquote unprecedented things start happening and we start realising that we are kind of living through quite a historical period of time?
Gosh, you know, from my perspective in the United States, it doesn't feel like it. It feels like we're not learning the lessons of our past, and we're not investigating things that have happened before and interrogating those facts and figuring out kind of what lessons can be learned, right? There seems to be this hesitation to engage in the past and not understanding how it can contextualize your present. That's just my little perspective on my corner of the internet. You know, obviously I follow a lot of historians and academics, and they obviously are very, very engaged in the moment and kind of tying current events to past actions. But I think overwhelmingly there's still a disconnect, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. You know, I think we have so many things going on in our daily lives that if you didn't connect with history maybe at a younger age as an adult, you're not going to go and proactively seek out, you know, more history. And you know, people have other concerns on their mind. And so while I understand that, that's part of the reason why I try to do something short, sweet, to the point, to generate that interest and to hopefully help them ask more questions. Because I think what is history if it's not asking questions?
Exactly. I find it fascinating. I'm a journalist by trade, and I worked at a newspaper last year. We had this Way Back Wednesday segment where you'd look at the paper from 20 years ago, and it was very fascinating, some of the common through lines, but also I've had some deaths in the family, and going through historical photos or files or even like newspaper clippings, and just to think about how important recording that history is as well. You know, for someone like you to be able to rely on resources to tell these stories and tell stories that maybe sit out of your worldview or perspective that you would especially through the beauty of the internet, and being able to learn that, I think it's just such a really important part of what we're learning. Do you find that people are doing, like, are seeking these lessons from time to time? They go, you know, is there intrigue as to, you know, where some of the similarities of today's events may sit in the past?
Yeah, I think definitely, at least in my listener base, I get pretty consistent feedback on the fact that they enjoy learning a different perspective of stuff that maybe they learned, you know, in their undergraduate work or in high school. And then also, too, that they've learned things that they didn't really hear about. That's one of the other kind of sole purposes of my show, is I want to cover both the known and the unknown. And yeah, it's great to see in comments on the social media posts, you know, oh, this reminds me of this other episode that you did, and oh, this reminds me of this current event. So I definitely think, at least within my audience, they are very astute. They are making connections, and I think there is an appreciation for trying to capture the past and trying to memorialize it and offer new voices and new perspectives, right? History for so long has been told in a kind of siloed, singular method. And so I think one of the glorious things about the internet, for all of its drawbacks, is it has democratized the study and dissemination of history. Obviously, there's going to be some that are better than others. There's going to be people that have better access to more resources. But that has been one of the things that I have appreciated moving into this space, is that by and large, if you have an internet connection, you can access a wealth of information. And I hope that my show contributes in some small way to really engaging people's thought processes and really reigniting a passion for understanding our past, so that they can understand our present.
Yeah. I suppose, it's an interesting job to kind of land yourself, talking about history. Were you a history buff? You mentioned a little bit. You mentioned before that you're a bit of a history fan, but was this something that you did in any sort of professional context beforehand? Or is this something that kind of just by interest has come into your world? Yeah, no, never a professional historian.
Wish I could, but unfortunately, there's not a huge job market for professional historians these days. But the itch was initially planted back when I was in my younger days in middle school, 8th grade. Mr. Lamb, he will always get a shout out whenever somebody asks me where my love of history started. And what I appreciated about him, actually, and I think what got me to connect to history in a new way, was we were talking about the founding of the United States and the founding fathers. And these were men who, throughout my education thus far, had been these revered, amazing figures. They could do no wrong. There was nothing wrong with them. They were kind of almost godlike, right? And Mr. Lamb came in and called a spade a spade. He talked about Thomas Jefferson owning slaves, George Washington owning slaves, and he had a way of referring to these founding fathers that made them human, right? He wasn't trying to be caustic, but he was unafraid to say, hey, these were imperfect people that created an imperfect system that we are still living in to this day. And let's understand kind of their context so that we can understand how we got to this moment. And so that's kind of what triggered my love for history. And I originally went to school and got an undergraduate degree in history, thinking I might go into the law. And in the United States, there's not really a pre-law major, so they just said, pick something that's going to make you read a lot, write a lot, and analyze a lot. So I thought, okay, history.
I do love that. Like, in Australia, you do a Bachelor of Law. Like, you major in law straight out. You actually choose what's, like, part of the law you want to specialise in to start with. But I was like, you just go and find something you want to write and do a lot of analyzing with. Yes.
So, I went and got my undergraduate degree in history, and really immediately wanted to go in and pursue graduate work, and wanted to go into a master's program. And at the time, I had a very honest conversation with a mentor of mine, and he said, your writing isn't where it needs to be, and maybe rethink your process here. And this was a time before there was a lot of understanding about first generation students, and maybe kind of having more of a constructive dialogue of like, hey, if you want to do this, this is what you need to do in order to prepare. This is what you can expect. And so I took him at his word, and I went into a completely different direction. I went into public service, which is something I'm still in today. And but I always had that itch. And always had that passion. I, made sure I gave myself a reading goal. I wanted to read a biography of every president before a certain age. And so it was always there. And then I think in 2020, again, having all this time alone, I didn't want to start a sourdough starter. I didn't want to bake bread. Didn't want to plant a garden. And so I just had all this time on my hands, like so many other people. And it just, the history kept coming back. And then I was having these conversations with friends, and getting kind of this receptive, like very positive feedback of like, hey, I'm not normally somebody who enjoys history, but I really like kind of how you explain things and break it down. It makes it a little bit more accessible. And so that's kind of what prompted the podcast to begin with. And then it's this weird full circle moment, because the podcast and engaging with listeners and engaging with historians really gave me the confidence and the bravery to attempt another shot at graduate school. And so I just wrapped up my graduate program, and it was so fulfilling and so wonderful. And I felt like I definitely had a great breadth of training, and makes me, I think, a better historian for it, even if it doesn't turn into my quote unquote 9 to 5.
Look, A, congratulations, and B, like, to be honest, I feel like most graduate programs, I don't know, in my head, and maybe because I hit the ground running so hard, in my head I'm like, why do I need to do a graduate program? And then someone very rightfully explained to me, in the context of journalism, if you go and do a master's program overseas, you actually get all these connections and maybe even get to work overseas. And I was like, oh, maybe that will help me achieve my goal a little bit better than, what I thought I had to do to get where I wanted to be. It's the art of stepping sideways instead of upwards. So, as you said, this content is more aimed at adults who are, revisiting or wanting to know more. Is there I don't know. I find this very fascinating, because we often point to, our education system as, this is why, we don't know enough about history, Is there limitations in maybe the education system that, by having frank conversations with adults about history in perchance a podcast form, but even in conversation, that allows you to have this, be more productive and spread awareness and understanding much more effectively than, say, in a formalized classroom setting?
Yeah, I think, I remember going to my classes as a high school student and being very interested in what I was interested in, and could not care less about the stuff that I just did not have any interest in. I'm a hard sciences, not for me. Math wasn't for me. Didn't like it. There's nothing you could do to get me to be fascinated or interested in it. And so I think that's the difference, right? As an adult and coming into a podcast, right? Nobody's forcing you to sit in this classroom to listen to somebody drone on and on. In theory, nobody's holding a gun to your head saying, hey, listen to this podcast. And so, adults are coming to it with a sense of curiosity. And I think there is something to be said about wanting to be there and wanting to learn, and that leads to you being more receptive to wanting to find out more and to get interested. And so I don't know necessarily that it's a limitation of the educational system. I think it's just when you're a teenager, you have your interests, and almost always they are not with school.
Not whatsoever. There are so many memories I have of trying to waste as much time at school. And I was considered a smart kid. This was like, I was the one who did the hard sciences and the hard arts. I was like, yes, this is great. Also, let me figure out how much time I can waste.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that, because I think it's one of those things where it's very easy to notice this trend of, more education content directed at adults. And as you said, a lot of these people are coming at it with genuine curiosity and an open mind, first and foremost. And it's fascinating, because I speak to teachers and I speak to people who work in education or maybe work in policy, where you're pushing education onto adults when they don't necessarily may not want it, or finding creative ways to communicate unfriendly topics. And it's just such a fascinating problem of, how do we tell people about stuff when there is not necessarily a desire to know what is happening or to learn about it. I'm thinking of all things, I was editing an interview right before this about prostate cancer for work. And prostate cancer is not one of those things you want to talk about ever, right? But it's the medicine, we have to talk about this because this is actually important. It's the medicine before the sweet treat of whatever interesting angle you can take. Yeah. And I think it's such a unique problem when it comes to not just, history, but education and understanding context and, even like a cursory knowledge of, of all the subjects, define all the subjects, but, a cursory knowledge of a general knowledge that is what's supposed to be built through a high school career, is sometimes really, really hard.
Definitely. And, I think I look back at some of the stuff I wrote a very long time ago during those times, and I'm very thankful for the training and the education that I got in my history degree, because I think I didn't realize it at the time, even as an undergraduate, that I was being trained to ask very probing analytical questions, being able to make a sound, compelling argument, and being able to back that up with evidence. And that has helped me tremendously in my career, where I am basically responsible for explaining very complex, nuanced policies and procedures to people from all walks of life. And so, to your point, nobody wants to learn about prostate cancer until they have to learn about prostate cancer, right? So I think there's always going to be a pull. It just depends on where they are in their lives and how we can meet them at that moment and meet them where they need to, where they're going to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing. I think, I think about in terms of activism. I vividly remember as a kid, as I was, really shows how young I am. As I was finishing high school, the school strikes for climate were getting really into action. And it was really fascinating because you could tell the people who wanted and didn't want to listen to what was going on, regardless of whether they felt like they should or could, attend a school walkout, for example. Mm-hmm. And there were some massive ones, at least here in Australia, where, you kind of shut half the city down. And I vividly remember, making an argument at one point of, it really doesn't help their point that they're shutting the streets down and inconveniencing people. Mm-hmm. And then working in activism radio for 3 years, going, actually, that's kind of the point.
Yes, activism, historically speaking, has not been about being convenient, but about getting your message across in as robust a way as possible. And also, finding a way to resonate with people, and connecting kind of the larger issue to the individual in that moment, to get them to care, to get them to support. One of the things I can think of immediately is the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s in the South, in the United States, right? They purposefully made sure that they were getting photographed with the children being hosed by law enforcement for asking for civil rights, right? They did that very, very intentionally. And to a certain extent, it helped turn the tide. And so I always have my mind, obviously, in the past when I look at current activism, and yes, sure, you can have opinions about the way that they've decided to share their message, but overwhelmingly they're usually peaceful, and they're not meant to be convenient. If they were convenient, then they would be easily ignored, and then nothing would change, right? And their whole impetus, their whole motivation is to try to make sure that you're paying attention to what it is that is upsetting them and what they're looking for.
Yeah. In terms of communicating, obviously, we've alluded to a couple of times, history is quite wide and complex, and there's lots of intersecting stories and bits and pieces. Do you find it hard from time to time to condense a complex topic into 15 minutes?
Oh, for sure. It's definitely something I struggle with every episode, and there are some episodes where I just say, you know what, I can't do it. I just can't do it in a short amount of time, and I want to do this person, event, whatever, justice. And so guess what, people, you're going to get a couple of episodes. I did that with Frederick Douglass. I've they got done that with Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman when I've covered these individuals on the podcast. I'm currently in the middle of working on the United States Civil War, and that requires obviously a deep dive into Abraham Lincoln. And so that's spanning multiple episodes because there's no way you can kind of cover the man, the myth, the legend in 15 minutes. You just can't. So yeah, no, there's definitely those times where I am struggling with, okay, when to shut up? What can I cut? What are the really fascinating, interesting bits that I think will generate people's interests and will pique their interest even more to, again, just dive into their own little research and go down their own little research rabbit holes. Because if people at the end of my episodes say, you know what, gosh, that was good, but I have more questions and I want to know more, then I feel like I've done my job, because that's really what my goal is. My goal is to get people to refamiliarize themselves with history, and get interested in history. Find a way that works for you, right? Not everybody likes to read books. Not everybody enjoys a long form podcast. Some people just want to kind of get quick and dirty, and so I try to fill that gap, as it were.
Yeah, as you've said, parts of history just in general, but also US history is long and complicated, and there are many layers. Are there things that you have worked on and you've discovered parts of history that you haven't learned about?
Oh gosh, yes. And I'm always, it's actually one of the best parts of the podcast for me is discovering something new or learning a weird factoid that I hadn't known before. I had just recently worked, and almost always it comes from requests from listeners. My listeners are incredibly intelligent individuals, and they are always challenging me on different topics and events. And most recently, I just completed a listener request about the mass execution of 38 Dakota warriors during the Civil War. It was something that Abraham Lincoln was involved in, President Lincoln. And I had never heard about the Dakota 38. It wasn't something that was covered in high school. Obviously, I think when you're in high school, the Civil War is what you learn about when you learn about Lincoln. You don't learn much else. And that he was assassinated. And so to me, it kind of demonstrates how nuanced history can be, right? On one hand, Lincoln is an amazing administrator. He was an amazing president. I think he was the right man for the moment. He is arguably one of the best presidents in United States history, given what the challenge that he had in front of him. But on the other hand, this story specifically proves he was human. He had failings. He made an arguably incorrect call here. And that, to me, is what makes history so fascinating, is you can see yourself in somebody who is flawed. You can see yourself in somebody who's made mistakes. And that, I hope, really makes people get more interested and really want to kind of dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah. I always vividly remember as a teenager, the comedian here in Australia wrote a series of 3 books called Gert, True Gert, and I forget what the third one was. Anyway, it's about Australia's colonial history right up until just on Federation, which is about 1901. And I think they kind of cross over because obviously it's one of those complex things where there are things that are discussed in the late 1890s that roll into the early 1900s. And it's a fascinating book because a lot of what it does, because it's written by a comedian, is finds the funny and the silly in especially our colonial history. There's this whole chapter about very, very briefly summarising the reason why convicts had to be sent to Australia as opposed to the States. And, a brief mention of the Boston Tea Party and this whole thing of if the British were obsessed with tea, the Americans were even more obsessed with tea at that point. And, kind of a bit of poking fun and stuff. The second book features quite heavily William Bligh and the Bounty and his quest to bring, breadfruit to Jamaica, and the many, many mutinies. And of all things, one of his descendants happened to be the premier, which is Canadian Premier, Australian Premier, same thing, of a state, and it had an election go so bad for her that they called it the fourth mutiny of Bligh because it was so bad. But it's those things, those connections forward and backward that made the hilarity. I don't know. We talk about American history so much in quite serious, hushed tones, and we talk about, the good, the bad, the ugly, all with this reverence. Is there a silly side to American history that you found?
Oh, absolutely. History is filled with weird little quirky stories. I'm going to briefly touch on a story that I need to dive into more, but a professor was talking to me about while I was pursuing my graduate work, which was the squirrel murders. And so this was apparently an operation, and I'm going to butcher this because I have not actually dived into this, but there was apparently some military research where they were going to use squirrels. They were going to airdrop squirrels as some form of weaponry during World War I believe. And they had these little self-contained squirrels in these little boxes. And I just that's so weird to me. What? Why was this a thing? How did this happen? I mean, obviously it's a terrible thing for the animals. And so I guess still kind of not a great piece of history, but that's weird. That's quirky. And then, just the amazing things that I learned about with the World's Fairs. I had somebody ask me to do a dive into how those originated and just some of the just weird things that came about as part of the World's Fair. Just fascinating kind of weird little tidbits in history. So history is filled with weird oddities and interesting figures. I just interviewed somebody who wrote a book about Lemuria, which is this fake place that has kind of taken on an aura of Atlantis, right? It's Atlantis's cousin, as he explained, and the people that it has attracted and the reverence that it has attracted over the years, the fact that the story kind of still exists and people still are attracted to it, that stuff is kind of fascinating too. So history is filled with funny little anecdotes as much as it is filled with very important themes and questions and people and events. So
I suppose, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, your listeners are quite active in terms of requesting topics and talking and promoting this conversation. What have been some of the key takeaways from interacting with an audience like that?
Oh gosh. They're always forefront of my mind. Every time I approach something, I'm thinking of them. I'm thinking okay, these are smart cookies. And not that I'm trying to pull a fast one on anybody, because I'm not. I have such reverence for the field of history that, I'd be devastated if anybody ever thought I was kind of taking this in stride, right? I have a deep respect for the profession. But it makes me level up my game. It makes me want to make sure you're covering all the bases. What are some questions that people might have that you can tease in so that they can know to dive in a little bit deeper? And also, I just appreciate the diversity that I have. I have people throughout the world, places I've never even been, who are chiming in and giving support and telling me the things that they liked about an episode and things that they'd like to see in future episodes. And so it's nice. It's nice to have that engagement, first of all. And it's also just nice to know that it's resonating and that I wasn't crazy in 2020 thinking, everybody will like a short form podcast in history.
Yeah. You've said, it's got a bit of worldwide appeal. How important do you think is it to learn, obviously, like, in Western terms, we're an English-speaking culture. It's how important is it that other people from around the world know about the complexities of US history? We often, I know here in Australia, we talk a lot about how talk about the US as this monolith, and we talk about how government as the US's lapdog, in Southeast Asia. But when we talk about history, and we talk about the history of the world in general, how important is it that people from other cultures are understanding these intricacies?
Well, on the grand scheme of history, the United States is as the United States, not North America as the continent, but the 1776, right? That's a short blip on the radar in terms of, comparing ourselves to other countries. So I wouldn't necessarily say that understanding or knowing United States history and other cultures is somehow more important than knowing your own cultural history, right? But I think because the United States has had such a kind of dominant presence in world politics and geopolitics for so long, that I think that there is something to be said of understanding how we got to this current moment. But I would also flip that and say the United States could benefit quite significantly by enhancing our understanding of other countries' histories. And I'll be the first to admit I am woefully ignorant on things outside of my wheelhouse, something I hope to change eventually, and something I try to seek out and work a different factor of my brain. But I think it's important to understand how the country is presenting itself today in 2024 to know that long context. But I also think that it's important that the United States also open up its view and try to understand other histories to see why maybe something is showing up for us in negotiations, in treaties, in alliances, in military conflicts, so that we don't repeat some of the mistakes of our past. America, United States has had an empirical history as well. And so understanding what that did to other cultures and our role in the world, but also kind of decentering the United States, right? I think growing up here, I can say pretty unequivocally that we can be very self-focused when we're learning about our history. And
not to say that that's a bad thing.
It's not.
I think this is where I think critique on history teaching reaches a bit of a limit, because I think, and I was about to ask you, is it really hard as a member of the dominant culture when it comes to English-speaking cultures? Is it hard to remove yourself from that and go, okay, let's take in an alternate perspective? Because, I don't know, I find we're having a very interesting conversation here in Australia around Indigenous representation and rights. It's become a big thing. I look over at New Zealand at the way that, and they're not perfect either, but look at the way that they've integrated Maori culture into, even white presenting, people will use the Maori language to describe things in a way that us Australians don't with our Indigenous languages and our Indigenous history. And I look at, we have that struggle of we're the dominant culture, so therefore we should just only know the colonial culture, not the historical culture of the Indigenous people beyond a cursory glance. Would you say that that's kind of the same problem with the United States looking out to the rest of the world, or especially North America looking out to the rest of the world?
That's a challenging question. I think, well, I can speak to it from my perspective and building kind of this podcast specifically, right? I am a white English-speaking, heterosexually presenting woman, right? And so that inevitably will paint my worldview.
Yeah.
And so I want to be very mindful that I am being inclusive and telling stories that have historically been undertold, right? Whether that's talking about women in history, which I try to focus on. You know, if I talk about a president, I want to make sure I cover the first ladies and their wives. Or whether it's indigenous cultures, right? But then there is, for me at least, I want to make a very conscious effort of, I want to be mindful of any kind of appropriation. I don't want to, I don't want to take that history as my own history, because it's not. And I can study it and I can interrogate it and I can share it with the world. But, you know, my understanding of it will always be a little bit limited. And when I go and tell these types of stories, I try to be very mindful of my positionality and really seek out the scholars and the sources of those communities whenever possible. It's not always possible, and you know, I have to make do with what I can access, but when it is possible, I try to make sure I put those voices center stage. I try to make sure that I incorporate that perspective, that history, in sharing the story, because I think that it's important to elevate these stories, but then also do it in a respectful manner, because these cultures and people have been marginalized for so long and dismissed, you know, for such a significant period of our history. So it's a big task, and it's definitely one that I'm always very, very cautious as I step in. And I don't always get it right, you know, and I try to own that and be honest and upfront and transparent when, you know, for example, there is plenty of indigenous words and phrases and names that I know even if I listen to it in like a Google playback AI trying to tell me, I just won't get it right. And so I try to be very like respectful and say, I know I'm going to butcher this. I'm so sorry. But I'm trying, right? I'm trying to be, you know, respectful and mindful, and I'm aware of my shortcomings, and I hope that I do it in a manner that is, that betrays that respect and kind of conveys that across the board.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing. I think even, it's funny, I had a friend of mine who was reading out, we were doing a story on classical music, and we were reading out some names of classical pieces, and this French name comes up, and she's English Australian, I'm Australian, and we're both English speakers primarily. We both look at the word, we go, no, can't pronounce it. Like even my like limited knowledge of Italian and French through music just was like, nope. It's one of those ones where even like, and it's fascinating you mentioned, you know, even just trying to listen to, you know, indigenous names or names in different languages that, you know, you aren't familiar with pronouncing. You know, I'm really lucky. I spend a lot of time running at pronunciations to learn words. And even then, I look at some other people's pronunciations or, you know, words, and I go, I can't. I just like, it's so, you know, I know I'm just going to do a bad job. Not to say that I can't try,
right?
But like, you know, there's a difference between doing a good job and doing you know, and putting an effort in. So, and it's a fascinating thing. I think this is where like I feel like we all should learn a second language from like age 3, you know, just to be a little bit more malleable in this space. I can't roll my R's is just like one of these things that has come up so many times since even finishing high school. It's one of those weird things that people can do, and I look at it, there was a name that like required the rolling of the R's, and I was like, I can't do that. Or like I play trombone, and there's like technique that requires, you know, being able to roll your tongue. Can't do it. Like it's just one of those weird things that like you look at and you go, there are unique linguistic, you know, and socioeconomic things that mean that, you know, these people are pronouncing words in a certain way.
Yes.
To move on, because I feel like we dove a bit deep in that segment, and tangents are plenty. I suppose, where to next? As you said, you've just finished your graduate program. What do you hope the next few steps and next few years look like for the podcast and for yourself?
Yeah, I definitely have some ideas for expanding the Civics and Coffee universe. I just recently started a Substack, a newsletter, so subscribe if you haven't already. And I have some ideas for maybe some additional kind of bonus content that now that I have some free time, I can really dedicate to that space. And really what I'd like to try to do more of, because people seem to really enjoy those conversations, is having more historians and historical professionals. So whether that's people working at public history sites or, fellow podcasters and obviously academic historians and non-academic historians, those conversations tend to be very popular with the audience, and bonus too that I get to support a fellow historian or historical site. In it, not necessarily related to the podcast, but still history adjacent, is I'm really excited about what I produced for my thesis. In the States, you have the option, at least at my university, of doing a capstone project when you're doing your master's degree, or you write a thesis and you defend it. And I fell head over heels in love with my subject, and I've been told that there's a there, that there's some expansion that could happen in terms of more research in that area. And so I think, just personally, I would like to move forward with that research and see where it goes, whether that's an article or maybe a book one of these days. You never know. So I think those are kind of the things that I have on tap for Civics and Coffee, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I suppose that's quite an intensive process. And as you say, you've done that graduate program now. What was it like to balance focusing and really deep diving into one topic while also trying to give breadth and depth to an audience of listeners?
It was pretty intense. Luckily, by the time I had started the first semester of the program, I had a couple of years of doing the podcast under my belt. So I knew kind of time commitment wise what it was going to take to produce weekly episodes. And I had a dear friend of mine who was, several years into her PhD at that point. And so she had kind of given me a preview. We didn't study the same subject, but, a graduate program is a graduate program in terms of your reading and your writing. And so I had a sense of exactly how much I would be diverting my time. And my husband, funnily enough, said, well, you work full time, you're going to go to school full time, you're not going to, and you can't, and you're doing this podcast full time. He's like, one of the three is going to have to give in. And I said, challenge accepted. And so before I started my first kind of set of semesters, I really made sure I had a backlog built up, and I really effectively used those breaks in between the winter semester and the spring semester. It got really dicey there. This most recent semester, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to hit every week with an episode, but luckily it all worked out, and so I'm back to having, like I said, free time, and I'm getting much more caught up and ahead of the game, like I like to be. There are some podcasters who they'll say, I'll post it, the night before when I have it due, and I'm not somebody that operates in that space. I need to be super planned, a couple weeks in advance if I can. And so, it was pretty intense. But what I found too was I really do enjoy putting these episodes together. I mean, it was something I really looked forward to. I loved doing the reading and the writing and the research of my program, but I also really loved just crafting new little small episodes for my audience. And I think, the training that I got in my graduate program also made those episodes better. So at least I hope so.
Yeah. A question I completely forgot to ask, but is there an element to, I've spent a lot of time in science fields with people talking about the importance of science communication and communicating scientific findings and the scientific process for people to better understand and be more literate around things. We saw it especially in terms of vaccines in the last few years, but is there an element of an importance of that in the history field as well? Do historians sometimes struggle to communicate their processes and what's going on in their world of study?
I think yes and no. I think the internet has really helped historians connect with non-academic audiences. One of the best examples that I can think of is Jason Herbert, who runs the Historians at the Movies podcast. And he talks to historians, and they talk about movies and the history of the movies. And I think he brilliantly connects the movies to at least a little bit of the historian's research. And so I think the internet in that way has really benefited because it's democratized conversations. It's not, you no longer have to go to Harvard to hear from Joanne Freeman, for example, who's a pretty renowned historian here in the States, because she has lectures that are available on YouTube. And so I think it's getting better. But I still think, for whatever reason, there is still a disconnect in terms of the value of history and the value of historians specifically. There is a very specific set of skills that you need in order to not only just figure out what happened, right? Anybody can say, yes, I looked at this calendar journal and on this Thursday, this person said they did this, right? I think where historians matter and where I hope eventually we move to a place where we understand this as a larger populace is their study and investigation of the past help us understand our present when done well. And without them, in my personal biased opinion, I think we would be much worse off, right? I mean, even in the middle of the pandemic, historians were saying, hey, we've been through something similar before, the Spanish flu in 1918. And this is kind of what happened. And even masking, there was issues with masking back in 1918, much like there was in 2020. I think it's getting better. I think there's always room for improvement. And I'm excited to see where the next generation of historians take the conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alycia, for coming on Content and Capable. We have just not stopped talking. Sometimes you just have one of these episodes where I was like, I have so many more questions. I'm just going to have to hold my tongue and maybe save it for another episode. Where can people find you on the internet?
Sure, yes. I have a website, so www.civicsandcoffee.com, and that's where you can find all the links to all the other social medias. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Threads, I'm on the app formerly known as Twitter, and even try to mess around with Blue Sky sometimes. So I love social media engagement, but obviously my website is the easiest way to get a hold of me if you don't want to remember all the various handles. And and then obviously the Substack. So that's civicsandcoffee.substack.com. I'm still trying to learn all of the web addresses because it's still fairly new. So that's where you can find me.
Amazing. And has there been anything you've been reading or listening to or even, playing that you've wanted to plug?
Oh gosh, I would be remiss if I didn't plug one of the best history podcasters, in my opinion, around, which is Jerry with the Presidencies of the United States. Where I go short, he goes long. He does deep dives into presidential administrations in United States history. And for me, he is the gold standard of how to ask thoughtful, probing questions, how to understand and explain nuance in a way that is accessible. And so he is always on my rotation. And so I think I will plug my dear friend, Jerry.
That's amazing. Amazing. Well, you can find me at sam.the.journalist on Instagram and on TikTok. You can find the podcast at Content, the Letter N Capable on Instagram, and we're on Threads and Facebook and wherever. I just kind of like exist now. Message me. I get bored sometimes, and I like interacting with people. In a very similar history vein, I am going to plug the new season of Bridgerton.
Ooh.
By the time this episode comes out, we're in Bridgerton Season 3 Part 2 week, which I'm very excited about. I, as someone who watched a lot in terms of repeats and both versions of Pride and Prejudice as a kid, this is just peak. This is exactly what I'm here for. So I am absolutely loving every second of it. As an adult, enjoying it even more, I think. It's just so fun, so just geared towards you. And even some of the breakdowns I've seen of like dresses and learning a little bit more about that era of history, but also then what could have been. Like, I love this whole, let's create an alternate version of events where, you know, people of colour become prominent in society, and still having those underlying tones of, you know, what does indirect racism look like, and you know, the struggles of trying to be accepted in a society that you weren't historically accepted in. Amazing. Well, Alycia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've enjoyed chatting with you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Content and Capable was recorded, edited, and produced by Samuel O'Brien. You can follow the podcast at Content, the letter N Capable on Instagram, and you can find it on Facebook. You can also send an email through to contentandcapablepod@gmail.com with any of your thoughts, queries, or concerns. The best way to support the podcast is to leave a review on your preferred podcatcher so more people can hear the podcast. The art was done by Opia, and the music was written, edited, and produced by Jason Hilton. Content and Capable is proud to be a part of the Deus Ex Media Network, where you can find a podcast for any of your nerdy interests.
We are
Not the crystal gems.
We are the Bits,
The bits, the bits, the bits.
a Steven Universe review podcast
Celebrating the 10th anniversary.
of a show that's very near and dear to our hearts,
So get ready to cry with us
and try our best not to sing.
as we rewatch one of the gayest shows of the 2010s,
New episodes coming out to you every Friday.
featuring your favorite host, Charlie.
And Robert.
Thank you for listening to Content and Capable. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next week for another episode.
Deus Ex Media.